She was paid to have his baby and disappear, but the child changed everything. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Sierra Maddox stared at the ceiling of the cramped apartment, her eyes dry from nights without sleep and weeks sem descanso verdadero. At 21, she lived in a space barely large enough for two, sharing it with her mother, Nora, whose weakening body now rested on a makeshift bed in the living room. The cancer treatment had stalled after they ran out of money, and the only envelope left on the table was the final notice from the landlord, 3 days before eviction. Sierra worked at a small tailoring shop in a worn-down corner of Savannah, Georgia, sewing custom pieces for wealthy women she nunca conheceria for a dose adjust to binha. It barely paid enough to cover cheap painkillers, let alone the experimental chemotherapy the doctors said was the only real hope. They had already sold what little they owned: jewelry, electronics, even her grandmother's old armchair. There was nothing left to give. That morning, as she stirred a bowl of oatmeal for her mother, trying to mask the bitter aftertaste with cinnamon, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Standing outside was a man in a tailored gray suit who introduced himself with quiet authority. "Mr. Franklin Cole," he said, handing her a card. "Legal counsel. May I come in for a moment?" She didn't know what to say, but instinct told her to step aside. Cole entered without ceremony, opening a leather briefcase as he spoke. The proposal came fast, clinical, and without room for sentiment. A client, undisclosed at that point, was seeking a young, healthy woman with a clean background to carry his biological child through IVF. The terms were clear. The pregnancy would be medically supervised, and after delivery, the baby would be handed over. No contact, no further involvement. In return, the woman would receive a sum large enough to eliminate her financial problems. Cole explained, without apology, how they had found her. A firm specializing in biometric data analysis cross-referenced public health databases, employment history, and legal records. Sierra had surfaced at the top of their list based on medical reports, work consistency, and absence of criminal or behavioral concerns. Her identity and address were confirmed before his visit. She sat still, stunned, barely listening as he placed the folder on the table. 48 hours to respond, he said before leaving. Call me when you've made your decision. That night, Sierra waited until her mother was asleep to sit at the kitchen table with the document. The legal terms were brutal in their precision. Required testing, relocation to a private residence, full isolation, no visitors. Meals, clothing, and medical needs would be covered. Upon birth, she would receive the remaining balance of the payment. Her identity would be kept confidential, and she would relinquish all rights. Any breach would lead to legal consequences. It was not a favor. It was a transaction. At 3 a.m., she was still awake, sitting beside her mother's bed with the contract on her lap. The wording left no room for doubt. But she didn't need more time. She had seen the edge of desperation, and this was the only thing resembling a path forward. When a stranger offers you something that saves the only person you have left, it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like gravity. The next morning, Nora woke with a fever, and Sierra didn't have the money for an urgent care visit. She sat on the couch with the business card in one hand and her phone in the other. Dialing was easy. Speaking the words wasn't. But when Cole answered, she said it firmly. "I accept the terms." There was no surprise in his voice, only logistics. He told her the initial test would be scheduled immediately and that a deposit would reflect in her account by the end of the day. By nightfall, Sierra had paid 2 months of overdue rent and scheduled the first round of her mother's treatment at the public hospital. Nora, of course, knew nothing about the real source of the money. Sierra told her she'd accepted a job out of town, one that offered room and board. Nora smiled through tears in relief. "You deserve something better," she said. "You've given up too much already." Sierra packed lightly. Basic clothes, toiletries, a photo of her and her mother. She left instructions with their neighbor, Mrs. Crawley, who had helped watch over Nora before. Then she stepped into a black SUV sent by Mr. Cole. The drive was long and mostly silent. The destination, a large coastal home just outside Tybee Island, secluded from everything, with sea views and private access. It looked more like a luxury retreat than a place meant for medical observation. At the front door, a woman in her 60s greeted her with a composed smile. "Mrs. Edith Barnes," she said, "I'll be your primary caretaker during your stay." The house ran like clockwork. Breakfast at 8, blood pressure checks at 10, afternoon walks supervised, evening meals portioned. The bedroom assigned to Sierra was spacious but devoid of anything personal. Next door, another room sat prepared with only a crib and empty shelves. No decoration, no toys. A blueprint. Mrs. Barnes explained the routine calmly and professionally. Sierra followed each instruction. She barely spoke during meals, and at night, the silence of the house was heavier than the waves outside. She told herself she could manage this. 3 trimesters and done. But every time she passed the closed nursery, her stomach twisted. Not for nausea, from something harder to name. The days that followed moved with mechanical precision. The house Sierra now lived in didn't feel like a home. It resembled something engineered, each element arranged with cold efficiency, as if to minimize the presence of real life. Her mornings were filled with tests and forms. A nurse arrived daily for blood draws, checkups, and long lists of questions she answered without expression. The bedroom she occupied was immaculate but impersonal, like a showroom model of what comfort was supposed to look like. Sierra followed the schedule. She ate what was served, walked when told, rested on command. The ocean could be heard through the windows, but even that began to sound like background noise in a place where everything was stripped of spontaneity. Mrs. Barnes, ever composed, fulfilled her duties with practiced courtesy. She brought clean linens, monitored meals, and updated medical files. Beyond that, she offered little else. No small talk, no warmth, just the rhythm of protocol. Everything shifted the morning Sierra was taken for her first ultrasound. The clinic was nearby, a private facility that had been booked exclusively for her appointment. She was escorted by a young nurse who introduced neither herself nor the technician. The doctor, a woman in her 40s with a practiced, neutral tone, explained what would happen, gestured toward the screen, and adjusted the equipment without fanfare. And then there it was, the flickering shape on the monitor. A sound, steady and unmistakable, pulsed through the room. Sierra stared at the screen. The image looked like nothing and everything. A forming spine, a rhythm. Her lips parted slightly. Her hand instinctively moved toward her stomach. She had read about the emotional impact of this moment, but nothing prepared her for the visceral ache that rose from her chest. That wasn't a contract. It wasn't a transaction. It was a heartbeat. It was her child. And for the first time since she arrived, Sierra wanted to cry. Not from fear, but from the undeniable truth that something was growing inside her. And it wasn't just tissue. She didn't speak much on the ride back. Mrs. Barnes noticed, but said nothing. Sierra went straight to her room, locked the door, and slid to the floor, knees drawn to her chest. Her face was hot, her breath unsteady. The routine that once kept her afloat suddenly felt like a cage. That night, unable to sleep, she asked Mrs. Barnes, almost without thinking, if she had any spare fabric or thread. The next day, a small bundle was left on the table. Soft cotton pieces, a few neutral prints, and a compact sewing machine. No note, No questions, just the tools. Sierra set them up on the desk near the window and began to work. Slowly at first. Lines weren't always straight. Her fingers fumbled, but brought her back to something she knew. Something she could control. She began sewing small items. Baby-sized. A hat, a pair of mittens, a blanket with stitched stars. She told herself they didn't mean anything, that she was only passing time. But she wrapped them carefully and stored them in the back of her closet like they were secrets. Weekly calls with her mother were scheduled every Sunday afternoon. They were supervised. Mrs. Barnes sat in the room, but never interfered. Nora's voice had more energy than before. The treatments were working slowly, and that gave Sierra something to hold on to. "You sound tired," Nora would say. "Are they working you too hard?" Sierra always gave the same answer. "It's just a lot to learn. But I'm fine." Nora never questioned it. She spoke about hospital meals, nurses she liked, plans for when Sierra could come home. Each call was a mixture of comfort and guilt. Sierra smiled through them. After each one ended, she would cry. Quietly, always after the line disconnected. By the third month, her body began to change. She noticed the weight first, how her clothes clung differently, how her steps felt heavier. One of the nurses noted the bump during a morning check. "Growth is on schedule," she said without inflection, as if reading a meter. The observation stayed with Sierra all day. She stood in front of the mirror that night, hand on her abdomen. The swell was undeniable. She began speaking to the baby in the quiet hours before dawn. Descriptions of the room, of the sky outside, of the fabric in her hands. She never said his name out loud, but she had one in mind. Rowan. It came to her during one of those nights when sleep was impossible and the sea sounded closer than usual. Rowan meant nothing specific, but felt right, like a soft syllable that belonged only to them. She had not seen or heard from the man behind the contract, Grant Ashford. Everything came through Mr. Cole, who now scheduled virtual updates bi-weekly. Mr. Ashford is pleased with the progress. Mr. Ashford has approved the new nutrition plan. Mr. Ashford expects all terms to remain unchanged. These statements were never followed by questions. Sierra was not invited to offer feedback. Her only role was to comply. Mr. Cole's voice never changed. He never asked how she was feeling, never even referred to her by her name. She was part of the process, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just carrying out terms. She was growing a life, and that life had already begun to respond to her in ways the contract could never measure. One night, during her usual walk through the hallway, she paused at the doorway to the nursery. It remained untouched, walls painted, crib assembled, but no personality. She lingered, didn't step inside, just stood there, her hand resting on the frame. Mrs. Barnes passed by quietly, then stopped. "Thinking of decorating?" she asked, voice lower than usual. Sierra turned slightly. "I like to sew something for the room, even if I'm not here when he arrives." There was a pause. Then Mrs. Barnes nodded. "Then sew it. What we don't say, sometimes the hands speak for." It was the first personal thing she'd said since Sierra arrived. It lingered in the air long after she walked away. The fourth month began with more intensive testing. Sierra was taken to a specialist's office where high-resolution scans and blood work were conducted to assess every measurable aspect of the pregnancy. The results came back normal. Healthy development, ideal growth, nothing out of place. But for Sierra, the data was only part of the picture. She held the envelope containing the results tightly on the drive home. Fingers curled around the edge as if trying to hold on to more than just paper. Back at the house, she went straight to the sewing corner. Mrs. Barnes didn't ask questions. Sierra sat for hours, stitching in silence, the soft hum of the machine like a lullaby that didn't need words. She finished a small blue piece, a onesie with tiny star patterns. folded it gently, smoothed the seams, and placed it with the rest. Rowan. That name stayed with her all day, repeating like a quiet anchor. Rowan, even if he never knew. The following week, during a routine video call with Mr. Cole, something changed. Mr. Ashford has requested to meet in person, he said without preamble. It's a formality, just a signing of custody-related documents. Sierra froze. She'd never seen him. Not in person. Not in photos. He was an abstract figure, someone whose name only existed in clauses and schedules. Now, she'd have to face him. She tried to ask if it was necessary, but Cole was already moving forward. It'll be brief. That was all he said. For days afterward, she couldn't sleep properly. The idea of standing in the same room as the man who had paid for her womb unsettled something deep inside her. He wasn't just a concept anymore. He was real, and he was coming. On the morning of the visit, Sierra wore something neutral, comfortable, nothing that accentuated the bump or concealed it too much. She wasn't sure what would be appropriate, but she didn't want to make a statement. Mrs. Barnes guided her to the library, one of the only rooms she hadn't entered since her arrival. The door opened, and he was already there. Grant Ashford stood by the window, tall and composed, wearing a dark sweater over a collared shirt. His hair was short, dark, neatly styled. When he turned, his eyes met hers, then instinctively dropped to her stomach. He nodded. Nothing else. No handshake. No introduction. Mr. Cole began explaining the documents. Grant signed silently. Sierra signed in turn, each stroke of the pen heavier than it should have been. When it was done, Grant finally spoke. "Is everything going well?" The question caught her off guard. "Yes," she said simply. "Everything's progressing normally." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was hollow. Grant returned his gaze to the table, but Sierra noticed something shift in his expression. Not quite tension, but awareness. As if he was only now registering what this arrangement actually meant. When she felt Rowan move, she instinctively placed her hand over the bump, a gesture she'd repeated countless times. Grant saw it. He didn't comment, but he lingered. When Mr. Cole announced they were finished, Grant thanked her, nodded again, and left the room with quiet steps. Mrs. Barnes entered shortly after, asking if she needed anything. Sierra shook her head and returned to her room. She lay on the bed fully clothed, eyes closed but not sleeping. The encounter left her drained in a way she hadn't expected. After that meeting, something inside Sierra began to solidify. She could no longer pretend that this was just a temporary role she was playing. Rowan was more than a heartbeat or a growing body inside her. He had weight. He had space. He had become hers, even if only in private. Grant's presence hadn't been emotional or dramatic, but it was real. He was no longer just a name on a contract. He was the father, and that made everything feel more permanent. That night, Sierra didn't sew. She sat on the balcony outside her room, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the ocean in the distance. She spoke softly to the baby, not in full sentences, just fragments, thoughts she didn't understand herself. It wasn't about letting go anymore. It was about holding on, at least until she figured out what that meant. Routine resumed in the following days. Same meals, same calls, same checkups, but Sierra began sewing with more intensity. She no longer stitched absent-mindedly. Each item felt loaded with intention. She created a small pile in a separate box, a star-patterned blanket, a pair of booties in forest green, a onesie with hand-embroidered clouds. Then she wrote a letter. It started as a few lines, but turned into pages. She told Rowan about the first time she felt him kick, about how she read to him at night, about the name she had chosen. She didn't know if he'd ever read it. She just needed the words to exist somewhere. When she finished, she folded the letter and tucked it into the box beneath the fabrics, hiding it deep in the closet. She didn't know what she would do with it, but it needed to be there. One afternoon, after returning from a checkup, Mrs. Barnes met her at the entrance with a sealed envelope. "You have another meeting. He's requested an update in person." Sierra blinked. "Today?" Mrs. Barnes nodded. She didn't ask why. Just went to her room, washed her face, changed her clothes. The meeting wasn't on the calendar. There were no legal forms to sign. No instructions from Mr. Cole. Whatever this was, it wasn't part of the contract. And that alone was enough to make her chest tighten with uncertainty. The meeting was set for late afternoon. Mrs. Barnes delivered the news with the same composed tone she always used, but Sierra noticed something, an almost imperceptible pause before she spoke, as if this particular encounter required more care than the others. Sierra spent the rest of the day trying to silence her racing thoughts. Why did Grant want to meet again? Mr. Cole had made it clear that all legal matters had been handled. There was no obligation, no remaining documents to sign, which meant Grant Ashford had chosen to come. Voluntarily. That single fact disrupted everything Sierra had spent months trying to compartmentalize. She didn't overthink her outfit. Just something clean, comfortable. She wanted to feel grounded, not displayed. The library was bathed in soft light from the setting sun when she entered. Grant was already there, standing by the same window as before, but this time he turned as soon as he heard the door open. He didn't smile, but there was something different in his expression. Not the calculated distance from their first meeting. Something closer to searching. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. Sierra gave a small nod and took the seat he gestured to. Grant remained standing for a few moments before joining her across the coffee table. The silence between them didn't feel cold. It felt open, like space being cleared before something difficult. "I didn't expect to feel anything about this," he said, breaking the quiet. "I thought it would be procedural, detached, but I do feel something." Sierra didn't respond right away. She watched him closely. He wasn't performing. He looked lost. "I see what's happening," he continued, "but it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. It feels real." She placed a hand over her belly instinctively. Rowan had started moving more lately, especially in the evening. "He's active," she said, "more than before." Grant glanced at her hand. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "I know this wasn't your dream. I know you did this because you had no other choice. I didn't think about what that really meant for you." For him. Sierra didn't shift in her seat. She didn't blink away. "You treated this like a transaction," she said. Her tone wasn't angry. It was a plain truth. Grant didn't flinch. "I did." The confession sat between them for a moment. "I thought I could separate the emotion from the function. I thought I could plan a family like I plan a business move. But that's not what this is. He's a person. He's already someone." She held his gaze. "He is." There was no accusation in her voice, only clarity. "And he's also mine, not just yours." Grant nodded, slowly. "That's why I came. I've been thinking about what I can give him besides my name or genetics. And this might not matter much, but..." He reached into a messenger bag beside his chair and pulled out a small cloth-bound book. "My mother used to read this to me. I don't know if it'll mean anything to him, but I thought maybe you could read it to him." Sierra took the book carefully. The cover was worn, the corners soft from years of turning pages. She didn't open it. She just ran her fingers across the texture. "You wanted to have something from you," she said. Grant looked down at his hands. "Something that doesn't come from a contract." She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. That night, alone in her room, she opened the book. The story was about a tree that lost its leaves and learned to grow again. Simple, but honest. She read the first few pages out loud, even though no one was listening. Or maybe someone was. Rowan shifted slightly, just under her ribs. She smiled without realizing. "That's from your father," she whispered. "He doesn't know how to show it yet, but he's trying." And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was lying to protect herself. She felt like she was telling the truth. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm that felt slower, heavier. Sierra resumed her routine, but the emotional undercurrent that had settled in after the meeting with Grant didn't fade. She found herself pausing more often between tasks, during her walks in the sewing room by the nursery door. Rowan had become more than movement. He had become presence. She whispered to him at night, humming unfinished melodies, describing the clouds, the ocean, the thread she stitched. But now, her voice held hesitation, not uncertainty about her bond with him, but about the world waiting outside the boundaries of this temporary shelter. Grant didn't visit in the days that followed, but his presence remained. It lingered in the book on her nightstand, in the memory of how he had spoken, not as a businessman, but as a man trying to undo something he couldn't name. One afternoon, as Sierra worked on a small blanket, Mrs. Barnes entered the sewing room carrying a package. "This came for you." Instructions said it's to be delivered directly. Sierra wiped her hands on her apron and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in soft tissue, was a glass bottle of perfume with a handwritten note, "For when you feel more like yourself again." Signed, simply Grant. She stared at the bottle for a long time before uncapping it and dabbing a small amount onto her wrist. The scent was gentle, faint, something you wouldn't notice unless you were close. It stayed with her through the rest of the afternoon, like a question that had no clear answer. Why was he doing this? Why now? That weekend, Grant appeared again. Mrs. Barnes had warned her earlier that morning, and even so, Sierra's heart sped up when she heard his voice in the hallway. He didn't wear a suit this time, just a light blue shirt and khaki slacks. He looked more like someone who belonged near the ocean than in a boardroom. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him, unsure. He led her to a part of the house she hadn't explored yet, a sunlit room with large windows, wooden shelves lined with fabric bolts, and a sewing machine she'd only seen in catalogs. "I had this set up for you," he said, "in case you wanted your own space to keep working." Sierra walked slowly to the table in the center, running her hand along the smooth grain. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice calm but guarded. Grant nodded. "I know. It's not about necessity. It's about what's right." She didn't answer. The gesture wasn't small. It wasn't meaningless. But it brought a mix of emotions she wasn't ready to untangle. She thought about her old apartment, the worn table she used to work on, the way she sewed late into the night to afford medication. This new space was bright, equipped, filled with potential, but it also echoed with everything she'd lost. "Thank you," she said at last. Grant didn't push for more. He gave her a quiet nod and stepped out, leaving the door open behind him. The next morning, while testing the new machine with a strip of muslin, Sierra received a video call from Mrs. Crawley. "Your mother wants to see you," she said. Nora's face appeared on the screen, pale but smiling. "Look at you," she said softly. "You're glowing." Sierra blinked, surprised by the comment. "It's the ocean air," she said, trying to keep her voice light. They talked about Nora's recovery, her appetite, a new nurse who liked to sing while she changed IVs. Sierra kept her answers simple. "I'm working on a project. It's helping me focus." Nora's eyes crinkled with warmth. "You always did make something beautiful out of nothing." It took everything for Sierra to smile back and not cry. After the call, she sat in the chair by the nursery window. The sunlight fell across the floor in golden streaks, and she could hear the tide in the distance. She thought about everything all at once. Nora's voice, Rowan's movements, Grant's silence. It didn't add up to anything yet, but it was forming something, a sketch, a frame. That evening, she returned to the book Grant had given her. She read aloud, her voice steady, her hand on her belly. Rowan moved again, soft and certain. "I don't know what this is going to be," she whispered, "but I know you belong here." and maybe so do I. Grant began appearing more often, though never without a stated purpose. He always arrived with a reason, a file to drop off, a medical update to confirm, a new piece of equipment for the sewing room. But each visit carried a subtle undercurrent, a presence that wasn't part of the official script. Sierra noticed it, though she never said anything aloud. He rarely stayed long. Sometimes he left notes tucked into a folder. Other times, a small item left on the table. A new spool of thread, a book of children's stories, or once a single handwritten sentence. He kicks more at night, right? It wasn't much, but it chipped away at the wall that had separated them for months. She never responded with words, but she kept every item. One gray afternoon, Sierra sat stitching the lining of a baby jacket when she heard a soft knock. Grant stood in the doorway, holding an envelope. "Test results from the last scan," he said. She looked at the papers, then back at him. "Everything's fine," he added. "He's healthy." She nodded. "I know." He lingered a few seconds longer, eyes dropping to the pale green fabric in her hands. "You have a way with these things," he said. "It's not just skill, it's detail, like you see things most people overlook." His voice didn't carry flattery. It was more like someone admitting a truth he hadn't planned to say aloud. She met his gaze. "I see what matters to me," she replied. He didn't respond right away. Then, as he stepped back toward the door, he turned. "Are you getting attached to him?" The question was direct, stripped of pretense. Sierra breathed in. "I'm caring for him. That's part of the agreement." Grant didn't move. "That's not what I asked." She glanced down at her belly. "I talk to him. I tell him about the house, about the waves. I hum sometimes when I sew." Her voice was quiet, but steady. "So yes, I'm attached." Grant didn't nod or speak. He just stood there for a moment longer before walking away. That night, Sierra couldn't sleep. The room felt too still. Her thoughts too loud. She sat by the window, blanket wrapped around her, watching the lights of passing boats far off in the water. She remembered the first time she'd felt Rowan move, how she had placed both hands over her belly in shock and wonder. She hadn't expected her body to respond with such certainty. She hadn't expected any of it. But now, it was impossible to separate herself from him. No contract could dismantle what had been built through shared heartbeat and breath. She thought about the letter tucked away in the sewing room. Maybe one day, Rowan would read it. Maybe he wouldn't, but the words were real. They mattered. 2 days later, during their scheduled call, Nora looked better. Her voice stronger, her face a little fuller. "The doctors think I'm responding well," she said. "It's slow, but it's something." Sierra nodded, managing a soft smile. "That's all I need to hear." Nora tilted her head. "You seem calmer lately. Not lighter, exactly, but more grounded. Is the job getting easier?" Sierra paused. "It's different than I imagined, but I'm doing my best." Nora didn't press further. "Whatever it is, I'm proud of you for sticking with it." The words landed hard. Sierra blinked quickly to keep the tears back. "Thanks, Mom," she whispered. After the call, Sierra walked through the house until she ended up in the library. The book Grant had given her was still there, resting on the shelf where she had left it last. She opened it absently, flipping through pages she now knew almost by heart. And then, tucked between 2 chapters, a card she hadn't noticed before. It was cream-colored, embossed with initials, G.A. On the back, a number. No note, no instruction, just a possibility left quietly. She held it for a long moment, unsure what to do. It wasn't just contact information. It was an unspoken invitation. And Sierra was beginning to feel that silence between them had reached its limit. Sierra woke up with a new kind of discomfort that morning, a dull ache low in her back that didn't feel like strain or fatigue. It was a pressure, rhythmic but unfamiliar, that made her shift position repeatedly in bed without relief. She pushed herself upright, breathing through the sensation, one hand braced on the mattress and the other resting over Rowan's curve. He was quieter than usual, moving only in faint pulses beneath her skin, as if mirroring her unease. The house felt unusually quiet that day. Mrs. Barnes was downstairs, and the usual morning bustle had not yet begun. Sierra wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the balcony, letting the wind off the coast hit her face with sharp clarity. She stood there for a long time, watching the tide draw back and return, again and out revés, trying to convince herself that everything was still within the realm of manageable. But something had shifted, not only in her body. Something else was building, between what had been agreed on paper and what was slowly becoming impossible to define. It wasn't long before Grant appeared. She was in the sewing room, reorganizing scraps of flannel, when his voice broke the calm. "Can we talk?" She turned toward him, surprised but not startled. He stepped inside, not as stiff as before, though still careful. In his hands, a form, a hospital form by the look of it. "It's the provisional birth certificate," he said. "They need a name." Sierra reached for it slowly, reading the pre-filled boxes. Hospital name, date of delivery estimate, signature lines. But the section for the child's name remained blank. "I thought you'd choose that," she said, almost defensively. "It's your legal right." Grant shook his head. "I wanted you to decide too." His voice didn't push. It simply allowed. She looked down at the form again, heart pounding unexpectedly. Then she said it. Rowan Maddox Ashford. The moment the words left her mouth, she felt them land like an anchor. Final. Whole. Grant took a second before responding. "It suits him," he said, and this time his approval felt genuine, not strategic. "Why did you agree so quickly?" she asked, still staring at the page. "Because it felt right," he replied. No explanation, no preamble, just that. Later that day, Sierra found herself in the nursery again. The room was nearly complete now. Soft blue walls, a white crib, floating shelves lined with neutral-toned books and plush animals. A mobile hung over the crib, delicate paper clouds suspended by invisible string. She sat on the padded rocker by the window, holding a navy blue onesie she'd finished sewing the night before. Her fingers smoothed the fabric without thought. She whispered the name again. Rowan. Saying it aloud made it real in a way she hadn't expected. She thought back to the nights she had murmured it in silence, cradling her belly as if the name were a secret spell. Now it had form, identity, and it was shared. That evening, Grant sent a short message through Mrs. Barnes. "I'll be in the garden. Come by if you feel like talking." Sierra read the note 3 times before deciding. She put on a sweater and stepped outside. The sky had turned amber gray, and the wind carried the smell of salt and distant rain. Grant sat on the old bench beneath the cedar tree, his jacket folded beside him. He didn't rise when she approached, just moved to one side to make room. She sat down slowly, both hands on her belly. The ocean spread out ahead of them in infinite rhythm. "I thought I'd just be relieved when all this was over," Grant said after a long silence. "But I'm not. I think I'm afraid." She didn't look at him. "Afraid of what?" "Of wanting more than what we agreed," he admitted. "Of ruining something by crossing a line I didn't understand before." Sierra stayed quiet for a while. Then she said, "The contract stopped making sense a long time ago." Grant let out a slow breath. "I know, but I don't know what to replace it with." They didn't speak after that. The wind filled the spaces between them. Rowan moved again, a steady roll beneath her ribs, like a hand reaching from the inside. She placed one palm over the motion, and Grant's gaze followed. He didn't ask to touch. He didn't speak, but he leaned slightly closer, just enough to make her feel that she wasn't alone. That whatever they were building, slowly, awkwardly, unsure, had started long before either of them had the courage to name it. They sat there until the light disappeared behind the horizon. Then Sierra stood, said nothing, and walked back inside, Rowan still shifting quietly beneath her ribs. Grant didn't follow, but he stayed long after the bench had gone cold. The rhythm of the days changed after that night in the garden, not in dramatic ways, not with declarations or sudden shifts, but in the subtle texture of presence. Grant no longer limited his visits to updates or documents. He didn't announce himself with a knock or formal tone. Sometimes he appeared mid-morning with a book in hand, other vezes at dusk, lingering by the edge of the hallway while Sierra finished sewing. He said little but stayed longer. There was an unspoken agreement forming, one that had nothing to do with contracts or legal terms. The house, once mechanical in its routine, began to feel like it was breathing. And with every day that passed, Rowan grew heavier in her body, more active, more real. The silence between Sierra and Grant was no longer empty. It was suspended understanding. One morning, Sierra asked Mrs. Barnes if she could see the nursery in its finished state. The request surprised even her. Until then, she had avoided entering the room completely. But something had changed. Mrs. Barnes didn't hesitate. Of course. Follow me. The room had been transformed. Soft blue walls with delicate hand-painted patterns of clouds and birds. A wooden crib with linen sheets, a plush blanket folded at the foot. A rocking chair near the window. Floating shelves with carefully chosen books. Some new, some with aged pages and handwritten dedications. Sierra stepped into the center of the room and turned slowly, absorbing every detail. The mobile above the crib caught the light as it turned slowly, suspended moons and stars spinning on threads so thin they almost disappeared. "You did all this?" she asked. Mrs. Barnes nodded. "He chose everything. He said it should feel like calm." Sierra walked toward the crib, trailing her fingertips along the wooden rail. "It does." Later that afternoon, she was seated in the sewing room, finishing a navy blue onesie with a stitched star at the collar when Grant arrived again. He didn't enter immediately, just stood in the doorway, watching her hands work. She looked up. "It's done," she said, holding the finished piece. He stepped closer and reached out to touch the fabric. "You have steady hands," he said, "and steady instincts." She shrugged. "Not always." He didn't push the point, but the way he looked at her was different. There was no distance in it, no calculation, only focus, only someone trying to understand something unfamiliar without trying to fix it. That evening, during her scheduled call, Nora commented on Sierra's tired eyes. "You're sleeping enough?" she asked. Sierra paused. "Not really. Rowan moves a lot at night." The name slipped out. It was the first time she'd said it aloud to her mother. Nora raised her eyebrows. "Rowan." Sierra hesitated but didn't correct it. "That's what I've been calling him." There was no backlash, no confusion. Nora smiled gently. "It suits him." After the call, Sierra stayed seated with the phone in her hand long after the screen had gone dark. She felt exposed, as if saying his name to someone outside the house had changed the way it lived in her mouth. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt like a door had opened. That night, Sierra was finishing a small set of mittens when she heard the floorboards creak. She turned and saw Grant walking in, holding a glass of water. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said, placing it beside her. She nodded in thanks, unsure what to make of his presence so late. He stood by the window for a while, then glanced down at a folded piece of fabric beside the sewing machine. "May I?" She nodded again. He picked it up, a square cloth with a single stitch star in the center. "Do you still call him that? When you're alone?" Sierra didn't look up. "Yes." Her voice was almost a whisper. "It makes me feel like he's more than a plan." Grant didn't smile, but he returned the cloth gently to its place and stepped back. "He is." Before leaving, he paused by the door. "I know the house feels big. The days feel fixed. But not everything has to stay as it is. If something needs to change, just tell me." His voice was low, almost cautious. Sierra didn't respond right away. She watched him walk away, the hallway light casting long shadows. She looked down at the star again, stitched by her own hands, and thought of the blue room, the name on the form, the way Grant had begun to see Rowan, not as an outcome, but as someone. And it terrified her to realize that what had started with distance and denial was now beginning to feel like a family taking shape without permission. The weeks that followed moved like glass, clear on the surface, but always carrying the threat of fracture just beneath. Sierra noticed the pattern in Grant's behavior. Carefully timed visits, brief conversations framed by practical needs, offers that never asked for anything in return. It was as if he were building something out of caution, afraid that too much proximity would break what little structure they had created. He continued bringing small gestures, a children's music player, a new basket of fabrics, a storybook left on the bench outside her room. None of it was intrusive, none of it was accidental, but it lacked the thing she had learned to recognize in her own rhythm with Rowan: surrender. Grant was still resisting something, though whether it was her, the baby, or himself, she couldn't say. And every time she thought of asking, she stopped herself, because she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answer. Inside the house, life remained organized and purposeful. The daily checks, meals, and prenatal routines continued with the same discipline that had defined her stay from the beginning. But the blue room was no longer just a neutral space waiting to be filled. It was lived in. Sierra spent hours there, folding clothes she had made, arranging books by size and subject, standing by the window and humming while Rowan shifted against her ribs. Sometimes she would read aloud, not just for the baby, but for herself, to hear something other than silence. She began to feel the weight of time. The date was approaching, and there was no longer a clear line between what had been promised and what had grown in its place. At night, dreams came. Dreams of the old apartment, of Nora's voice calling her from another room, of scraps of fabric piled on the kitchen table, and the familiar hum of her old sewing machine. In those dreams, Rowan was always near, even before he existed. She'd wake with the memory of his tiny weight in her arms, only to realize he was still inside her. It made her chest ache, but it also anchored her to something more real than the pages of any contract. He had a name now, a place, a voice she believed she could recognize even before hearing. The idea of walking away from him, as the agreement demanded, felt like fiction, not because she wanted to keep what didn't belong to her, but because the idea that he didn't belong to her had started to feel like a lie. The silence between her and Grant deepened, not from absence, but from accumulation. He still came. He still asked if she needed anything. But there was a restraint in his eyes, something that vibrated just under the surface. A fear, maybe, or guilt, or the inability to express what couldn't be cleaned up in a contract. One afternoon, he brought a small portable radio. "You said it was quiet," he offered. "Thought you might want some music." She accepted it without comment, but left it on the nightstand for 3 days before turning it on. It played soft jazz, instrumental and unassuming, and she found herself sewing to the rhythm. Still, she wondered, was this a gift or a wall? A way of speaking without saying anything? That week, Sierra took longer walks in the garden, ignoring Mrs. Barnes's worried glances when she pressed a hand to her back. The strain was increasing. The weight of her body was undeniable now. Rowan pressed lower, as if already searching for his path out into the world. One afternoon, she settled on the bench near the hydrangeas, her breathing shallow but steady, her her thoughts circling without direction. Grant appeared minutes later. No preamble. He sat at the opposite end of the bench. He didn't speak at first. The wind rustled the leaves, and Sierra kept her eyes on the sky. Then he said, "We're almost there." She nodded. And after, the question was too simple for the complexity it held. Grant hesitated, then looked down at his hands. "I don't know. I thought I would, but I don't." He sounded like a man who had built something only to realize he didn't know how to live inside it. She turned to face him. "Did you think about me when you wrote those terms? When you decided what this would be?" Her voice wasn't accusatory, but it carried all the quiet hurt she had tried to contain. He looked at her, then away. "I thought about avoiding pain. I thought if everything was clear, there'd be nothing to feel. But I was wrong." She swallowed. "And now?" He answered without lifting his head. "Now I want him to be okay, but I don't think I can do that alone." Sierra's hands moved instinctively to her belly. "He won't be alone," she said. Her voice was low but unwavering. Grant turned to her slowly. The weight of his silence felt heavier than any words. But in that moment, they both understood something neither had spoken. They had built this together, and now it was theirs to carry forward, no longer in isolation, no longer as strangers bound by legality. There was no promise made, no conclusion reached, but there was an opening, and sometimes that was enough. The early morning heat clung to the air like a second skin. Sierra woke before dawn, her body already aching, her breath catching in intervals that felt too measured to be natural. She lay still for a few moments, trying to decide if the pressure in her lower back was just another symptom of the final trimester or something else entirely. Then it happened again, a slow, tight wave that began at her spine and curved downward, pulling her into herself. She sat up slowly, hand braced against the mattress, and waited. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:14 a.m. The room was still, the only sound the distant rhythm of waves against the shore. She breathed through it, counted, waited again. Another contraction came, closer now and sharper. This wasn't pre-labor. This wasn't a warning. Rowan was coming, and everything she had spent months bracing for was no longer theoretical. It was time. She pressed the emergency button installed by the bed. Within minutes, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The nurse entered with practiced calm, her eyes scanning Sierra's face before checking her vitals. "We need to get you ready," she said. "The ambulance is on its way." Sierra nodded, teeth clenched against the next surge of pain. Mrs. Barnes arrived seconds later with a change of clothes and a bag already packed. The process felt both distant and intimate, like watching a scene unfold while living inside it. Sierra changed, wincing through each movement, and was helped down the stairs. The ride to the hospital blurred in her memory, flashes of passing streetlights, the nurse's firm voice on the phone, the tight grip she kept on the railing inside the ambulance. She focused on breathing, holding the pain like a shield between her and panic. She didn't ask who had been notified. She didn't think about Grant. All she could think about was Rowan, and the moment she would finally meet him. The hospital was prepared. Mr. Cole's arrangements had ensured that no detail was left unaccounted for. Sierra was taken into a private delivery room where the lights were soft, the equipment pristine, and the staff already briefed. The obstetrician who had followed her pregnancy since the first trimester arrived within minutes, reviewed the monitors, and gave a quiet nod. "You're progressing fast," she said. "This baby's not waiting." The contractions built in waves, each one more intense than the last, until they weren't just pain, they were force. Sierra clung to the sides of the bed, her hair damp with sweat, her vision blurring with each push. She didn't scream, but her face twisted with the weight of it, her body pulling from reserves she didn't know she had. Nurses moved quickly around her, voices giving instructions she barely processed. Somewhere in the chaos, she heard her own voice whispering to Rowan, "You're okay. You're safe. I'm here." When it finally happened, it came not with a burst, but with a breath, an exhale that broke into a sound she would never forget. Rowan's cry was sharp, immediate, and alive. The room stilled for a beat, as if the sound itself demanded reverence. Sierra collapsed back against the pillows, tears slipping down her cheeks without resistance. The doctor announced that everything looked perfect, and the nurses moved to clean and examine the newborn. Sierra, barely able to lift her arms, turned her face toward the nurse and said, "Please, let me see him." There was a pause, a look exchanged between professionals, and then Rowan was placed gently in her arms. He was small, pink, his eyes barely open, his breath fast and shallow like a whisper trying to stay alive. She touched his face, counted each finger, ran her thumb along the slope of his cheek. "Hi," she said, voice cracked and shaking. "It's you." The door opened behind them. Grant stood there, not stepping in, just watching. His posture was rigid, but his face betrayed everything else. She didn't flinch, didn't shield Rowan from him. She only looked at him, holding the baby with arms that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had changed. Grant took a slow step forward, then another. When he reached the bedside, he looked down at Rowan, then at her, and something shifted. He didn't ask for permission, but he didn't assume it either. Sierra looked at him, then gently passed Rowan into his arms. Grant held him awkwardly at first, unsure where to place his hands. But Rowan settled. His cries softened. His body relaxed. Grant stood completely still, eyes fixed on the infant, as if seeing something he didn't believe could be real until that moment. There were no words, no explanations, just breath and warmth and time. Sierra watched them, her heart aching in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't about regret. It wasn't about decisions made. It was about the truth of that room, the baby who was now between them, not dividing, but anchoring. Grant looked at Rowan's face for a long moment before speaking. "He's strong." Sierra nodded. "He is." A nurse entered quietly to check Sierra's vitals. Grant stepped aside but didn't leave. He remained at the foot of the bed, watching as Sierra kissed Rowan's forehead and pulled the blanket tighter around his chest. She looked up at Grant. Whatever happens next, he deserves more than a name on a page. Grant didn't answer right away. Then he said, "He'll have everything I can give, starting with you." The hours that followed the delivery moved in a rhythm disconnected from real time. The hospital room dimmed into a softer, quieter version of itself, as if adjusting to the presence of something fragile and new. Sierra lay in bed with Rowan beside her, asleep in the clear bassinet that stood sentinel next to the mattress. His chest rose and fell with steady determination, as if breathing itself was his way of affirming that he was here to stay. The nurse had returned twice already, once to check Sierra's blood pressure and again to examine Rowan's vitals. But both visits had passed quietly. There was no urgent chatter, no mechanical beeps, just the occasional scribble on a chart and the whisper of clean linen being adjusted. Grant remained in the room, seated in the chair opposite her bed, his posture rigid but his eyes softer than she had ever seen. He hadn't spoken since holding Rowan earlier. He didn't need to. The way he watched the child, the way his hands had trembled when he first cradled him, said more than any statement ever could. When the nurse stepped out and the door clicked softly behind her, the silence between them shifted. It no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like something waiting to be named. Sierra glanced down at Rowan, then back at Grant. "You saw him," she said. It wasn't a question. Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced tightly. "I didn't know what it would feel like," he replied after a pause. I prepared for everything. Contracts, logistics, but not that. He gestured toward the bassinet, unable to summon the right word. He's a person, Sierra said, her voice calm but resolute. Not a placeholder, not a solution to a problem. Grant nodded. I know that now. I think I knew it before, but I kept pretending I didn't. She sat up slightly, adjusting the pillows behind her. None of this is on paper, she added. Not the way he looked at me when he cried. Not the way I knew what he needed without thinking. And definitely not what I feel now. Grant stood and paced once toward the window, then back. I've been thinking about the contract, he said, about what it was meant to be, what became instead. Sierra looked at him, steady. It was a plan to keep us apart, she said. It made everything easier to control, until it didn't. He stopped, back turned to her, hand resting on the windowsill. I want to change it, he said. No, I want to get rid of it. She didn't answer immediately. Rowan stirred slightly, a small, contented sigh escaping his lips. What do you mean? She asked quietly. Grant turned around, walked toward her, then sat again. I mean this, what's happening now. It can't be shaped by a document written 6 months ago by someone who didn't know what this would feel like. Sierra held his gaze. What are you asking, she said. Grant's voice didn't waver. I'm not asking for custody, or to take him, or to erase you from his life. I'm asking to build something different, starting from where we are now, with both of us, not out of obligation, but because we both care about him. And I wanted to grow up knowing what that looks like. Sierra exhaled, eyes filling slowly. You still don't know what it means to be a father, she said. Neither do I, but we could figure it out. Together. Grant nodded slowly. I'd like that. She reached for Rowan and lifted him carefully into her arms. His eyes fluttered open briefly, then closed again as he settled into her chest. He already knows who we are, she said softly. He heard our voices before he ever saw our faces. Grant leaned closer, resting one hand on the edge of the bed, just near Rowan's blanket. I was afraid of ruining something I didn't understand, he admitted. But watching you with him, I'm not afraid of that anymore. Sierra looked up. Then start by being here. Not just in the room, but truly here. Grant nodded once, then reached forward slowly. His hand brushed Rowan's back in the gentlest possible gesture. The baby didn't flinch. He allowed a soft breath, a sound so small and familiar it tightened Sierra's chest. No one said the word family. No one tried to define what would happen next. But in that room, under the low hum of machines and the distant sound of hospital staff changing shifts, something real began to take root. Not because of a promise, not because of fear, but because two people have been altered by the same small soul that now breathed between them. And neither one of them was ready to let go. They left the hospital 2 days later. Rowan was wrapped in the same navy blanket Sierra had finished stitching weeks before, its soft cotton edge fraying just slightly, not from wear, but from having been held too many times with too much tenderness. Grant handled the discharge forms while Sierra sat near the window, with Rowan asleep against her chest, her eyes drifting between the newborn's profile and the cars outside that moved without any awareness of how the world had changed. When the nurse brought the final forms to sign, she paused for a second, as if sensing that this signature wasn't just bureaucratic. It was the closing of one chapter and the terrifying, fragile opening of another. The ride back to the house was quiet. No radio, no words, just the sound of the baby breathing and the occasional rustle of his blanket as he shifted. Sierra looked out the window the whole way, her hand resting lightly on Rowan's back. Grant drove, but even with his eyes on the road, she could tell he was tuned entirely to the small weight in her arms. The house no longer felt like a neutral zone. When the front door opened and Sierra stepped inside with Rowan for the first time outside her body, she felt the space respond. The nursery had been fully prepared. The crib made, the soft lamp turned on, the monitor charged and blinking. But it wasn't just that. It was the shift in energy. Mrs. Barnes had stocked the kitchen with Sierra's favorite tea. The sheets in her room had been replaced with fresh linens. There were bottles warming and a sterilizer on the counter. It was as if the house itself had braced for his arrival, as if every room knew something essential had changed. That night, Rowan slept in the bassinet beside Sierra's bed, and she woke 3 times just to check if he was still breathing, if his chest still rose and fell with that same tiny, determined rhythm. She didn't sleep deeply, but she didn't feel tired. Her body was learning a new kind of alertness. Not the survival mode she had lived in for months, but something softer, protective, maternal in the most raw and natural sense of the word. Nora arrived a week later. The doctors had approved her release from the clinic, and she stepped out of the car with a slow, steady gait that spoke of recent fatigue, but her eyes were clear, and when she saw her daughter standing in the doorway with a newborn in her arms, she stopped short. Her hand came to her mouth as if to catch the breath that escaped. "You didn't tell me," she said, voice trembling. Sierra nodded. "I couldn't. I didn't know how." Inside, once Rowan was sleeping, she told her everything. She didn't dramatize. She didn't hide the parts that hurt. She simply recounted the truth, what she had agreed to, what she had endured, what had changed. Nora listened without interruption, her face lined not with judgment, but with memory. When Sierra finished, there was silence. Then her mother said, "You gave everything to bring him here, and you found something in the process. I see in your eyes. I don't regret any of it, if this is where it led." The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm made of bottle feedings, diaper changes, cautious walks in the garden, and long moments of quiet with Rowan lying against Sierra's chest. Grant returned to his work schedule gradually, but every day he came back before sunset. Not always with something to say, but always ready to take Rowan in his arms, to rock him gently, to listen to Sierra recount the small triumphs and new struggles of the day. He never forced the intimacy, but he didn't stay on the sidelines either. They weren't living like a couple, but they were living something undeniably real. Rowan was no longer the center of a contract. He was the center of their shared attention, the silent orbit pulling them into a kind of family neither of them had planned for, but both had chosen piece by piece. One Friday afternoon, after returning from a brief visit to his office, Grant handed Sierra an envelope. "These are new," he said. "I spoke to my lawyer. You should read them." Inside were legal documents, but nothing like the original contract. It was a guardianship agreement, simple, clear, without clauses of separation or anonymity. "This is what I want," Grant said. "That he grows up with you, that your mother stays, that this house becomes what it was meant to be, and if you're willing, that I stay too." Sierra read the form slowly, her thumb tracing the signature line. "There's no deadline?" she asked. "No condition?" Grant shook his head. "Only your trust." That evening, Nora offered to stay with Rowan so they could have dinner alone. They ate at the long dining table, candles lit, but no pretense. The conversation was soft, about memories, about regrets, about things they had never dared to say in the months of negotiation and avoidance. Sierra told him about the sewing shop, about the dress she'd never finished for her mother's birthday. Grant told her about the accident that changed the course of his life, about the way fear had made him shut out everything that didn't fit into a column or a plan. They didn't toast. They didn't flirt. But by the end of the meal, they understood each other in a way that no contract had ever intended. When they returned to Rowan's room, he was asleep in the crib, one fist curled tightly beside his face. Grant reached out and adjusted the blanket. Sierra watched him in the half-light. "Do you think this can work?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, "but want to find out. With you. With him." She didn't answer. She stepped closer. Their hands met briefly over the crib's railing, not in declaration, but in agreement. They were not finished. They were beginning. And for now, that was enough. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.